everybody. It's so nice to be here and to be here to have the chance to see Mami's show. So thanks, Mami, for the invitation, and to the Biennale of Sydney for being so hospitable and giving me this chance to see so many old friends. I thought I might dedicate this talk, such as it is or will be, to the memory of Bill Wright and Nick Waterlow, two people who were so involved with the Biennale, and without whom I don't think it would have been possible for me to have done what I did here, and subsequently, and it's just sort of something to keep in mind, because certainly, one makes Biennales with a lot of help from a lot of friends. Mami mentioned other biennials and triennials that I've done, and it's true, and I'm not just saying it because we're here and you're you, but really my favorite one is the Sydney Biennale. The model of the Biennale of Sydney is something that René Bloch has talked about a number of times. Recently in Gwangju, in fact, I heard him talk about it in some detail, and I agree with him. I mean, it's a model that's particularly compelling. I mean, the other kinds of biennales that one does often come with certain conditions. Maybe the theme is already established before you arrive, and it's a conversation that you're invited to join in with, or there's a team that you're part of, and so inevitably decisions are made by committee, and committees have a particular dynamic. There are biennales. I did the Tate Triennial in 2003 and had to stick rigidly to British art. And as Mami mentioned, I'm the curator of the Quebec City Biennial next year. And I was talking to Joanne earlier. I have 40 artists, 20 of whom have to be Canadian, 10 of whom have to be from the Quebec province, and 5 of whom have to be from Quebec City. So, I didn't have such quotas to fill in Sydney, and also it was an exhibition that I had to myself, and an extraordinary opportunity to review what I had done so far, or to date, and of course an opportunity to undertake research that would manifest itself in the Biennale, but have a huge impact on what subsequently happened in my curatorial career. And also, I think I benefited enormously from the fact that it happened quite early on in my curatorial career. It was almost like laying down a foundation, which will become clear as we move through this sequence of slides. Lynne mentioned this idea, and we were talking about it earlier, the fact that you can't curatorially step in the same river twice, and there is something about this very individual point of view that you encounter at the Biennale of Sydney that's really something. If you asked another curator to do it at the same time, it would be a very different show, but if you asked the same curator at a different time, it would be a very different show. So things flow in and flow out of this Biennale in a very particular way, and certainly that's the case with me. The question that occurred to me, and it was actually sort of revealing for me to reflect on this, as Lynne explained in her case. Where was I in 1997 when invited to make a proposal for the Biennale of Sydney? And I thought I'd tell you where I was. I was at the Serpentine Gallery, and I undertook a number of exhibitions there. Langnans and Bell, who incidentally we have at Icon right now. We did big Jean-Michel Basquiat exhibition. We showed a great African exhibition, including the work of Bouabré, who Lynne mentioned. But perhaps the most important exhibition for me, and the way I was thinking at the time, and certainly that led then to the proposition of my everyday biennial, Biennale, was Fischli and Weiss, with their extraordinarily ordinary work, or work that is inspired by ordinariness and the everyday. I enjoyed our long conversations about what ordinariness was, and was extraordinary ordinariness desirable, or were we aspiring to the condition of ordinary ordinariness? It was an idea of finding some revelation or inspiration or some kind of epiphany in everyday experience. So here we have a sculpture. It looks like ready-made material, but is in fact sculpted out of polyurethane to look like found objects, the kind of things that would be cleared away from a conventional exhibition rather than exhibited. It's kind of, it's very smart and witty typically. And this small work that was in the Serpentine show, the Son et Lumière, Rayon Vert, the light is refracted through the pattern on the plastic cup, and you see this sort of wonderful sort of rainbow effects on the wall. It's a bit lost in this slide, but it's the idea that anything could inspire you and transport you, and it doesn't have to be an artistic gesture or a work of art. Of course, this is the question that's been there since the birth of modernism, the introduction of the ready-made, that makes us ask the kind of fundamental questions too that Lynne was referring to. The other thing about my time at the Serpentine was that we were in the process of reconstruction. The old building was being refurbished and turned into what you see now. Arguably, it lost quite a lot of its charm. I worked with Richard Wilson to make this piece called Jamming Gears, where the kind of buildings that you'd see outside a building site are brought into the building site and become intersected with the structure. And you'll see various sort of circles or discs that have been sort of bored out of walls. This is, a bit of the floor becomes part of the wall of the site cabin, and a bit of the site cabin becomes part of the bookshop around the corner, and a bit of the bookshop then is inserted into the site cabin on the left-hand side there. And there's this sort of idea of the inside going out and the outside coming in, and this fed very much into my idea for the Biennale of Sydney. Of course, you take something out, and when one thinks of the ready-made and the transformation of found object into a work of art, the idea of dedicated art space defines your artistic experience to a large degree. In fact, one could say fundamentally, and so by working outside the art space, which was something that necessarily we had to do at the Serpentine during this time, was definitely feeding in or flowing into my my Biennale experience. And it was a way of asserting a continuity between artistic experience and everyday life. Sort of easygoing way of communicating something quite a sort of, in a way, sort of a basically troubling question about how we identify art in the first place. Some people think this is perhaps the first pavilion of the Serpentine Pavilion program. This is a work by Kalamata, who took wooden material, particularly old doors, windows and whatnot, from inside the old building of the Serpentine, and it was brought out onto the lawn, used with other recyclable material. Very important part of his artistic practice, the idea of recycling, sort of coalescence of material and then its dispersal back into the ordinary world, the non-art world from which it came. And the same applies to Rasheed. This is a work made out of scaffolding that was on the lawn of the Serpentine. We're now looking from the large dome gallery onto the road that bisects Kensington Gardens. So this is this was the kind of thing that I had been doing before coming here, and my head was full of the kind of ideas that were occurring to me, of course, that led me to choose to do an exhibition of work by Fischli and Weiss, and engage with people like Kalamata and Rasheed. And it's no coincidence that you saw something very similar in Sydney. So this is Rasheed's Where There's a Will, There's a Way. It's a pyramid rather than a cube, and it's outside Government House in the Botanic Gardens. And here is a work by Tadashi Kalamata, sort of favela-like structures, shanty-like shelters that were strewn throughout the Botanic Gardens. There was this, too, something that I felt very strongly, and I communicated it at the time in interviews. I wanted people to sort of walk between these various works that were in the public realm. And of course, you sort of carry on thinking about them as you go, but you have all kinds of other experiences too. And I was wanting to suggest that, looking at, this work by Julian Opie may be as impressive as looking at a tree when you then went on your way to see the work of Olafur Eliasson. But going back to Julian quickly, this work, My Aunt's Sheep, was actually recently made just before this, and I thought it was sort of great to have this these sort of childlike representations of sheep on the site of the first farm, European first farm in Australia, and saying much about the nature of our settlement, European settlement here. And of course the artificiality of Olafur Eliasson's waterfall that sits in the Botanic Gardens, and you see it against this backdrop of the what do you call it, CBD, Central Business District of Sydney. It's very funny actually about this work, which is just not far from the harbour and various wharves and whatnot, is that because of health and safety, we had to rope it off this pool at the bottom because there was a fear that people would trip over, fall in, and drown. And to have that concern so close to the huge body of water that is Sydney Harbour struck me as being, odd. Then, not far from there was the Sydney Opera House. A number of things that we tried to do there, which I'll refer to later, and I know that Mami as well has had to negotiate the complexity that is the sacred site of the Sydney Opera House, and we did manage to pull this off. It was a work by Jose Rezende, who is a Brazilian artist, a sort of ballet of shipping containers. Kind of a beautiful moving sculpture, as of course you saw boats shipping full of shipping containers sort of cruising by through the bridge on the way to Darling Harbour and other locations. Not far from here, by boat, is Goat Island, and that was my island. Cockatoo Island wasn't available. And we, with Paula Leitos-Villiers, who's here in the audience, we spent a lot of time, actually quite a nice time, looking around trying to find an island, because I was quite obsessed with having something on an island. And Fort Denison was kind of too touristic and a bit out of the question, and Cockatoo Island was not accessible. What was nice about Goat Island was that people didn't normally have access, but the national parks made it more accessible for the Biennale of Sydney, and we showed the work of many artists there, including David Cunningham, Chinese artist Xu Jia, and Shimabuku. Shimabuku, Japanese artist, an artist also with whom Mami has worked, has the most sort of wonderful stories that sort of are sort of told through everyday experience and have a kind of magical quality. This is him on his search. No, he's traveling with with a 165-meter mermaid, but it's really the idea of it. And here you see the ferry. There is an image of the mermaid there. There's Aboriginal music. He's this idea of spirits, a kind of animism that is shared by Aboriginal communities here and in Japan, was something that he wanted to point out. And it was great for me because we had this problem how to pay for a ferry that went backwards and forwards to Goat Island. And there was a grant that was available from Sydney, the Sydney City Council, that if we turned this boat into a work of art, then we received, I think, something like $40,000 or $50,000 that paid then for the free sort of movement of the. I mean, Paula may tell me differently, but I got the feeling that we cover the costs. Anyway, and it was a boat that sort of took you there, this beautiful sort of music and idea of Shimabukus that took you then to the island, and you see more of his work there. And you get a chance to see what else was going on. Here in the Harbour Master's house, we had the work of Martin Creed, where he fills half the interior space with balloons, and that's what it looked like. Going back, it's great because it's a 3-story house, so the entire first story and half of the second story is full with balloons. So you walk in, and it's this. If you have a rubber fetish, it's like heaven. And well, all kinds of things went on in there. Apparently, now we then left the island and went back to the pier because the boat, in fact, to the right-hand side of the picture, that's where the little boat left and went to and fro the island. This is a work of Peri Roberts at the end of Pier 2-3, a very large colour chart, picking up on the colours of Sydney. It's a kind of abstract impressionism, and like a lot of the work in Pier 2-3, very much about place. So art, and I mean, I think the Biennale of Sydney tends to be inspiring in that respect, but I suppose because of the location and because of the visual access to the harbour, a lot of artists were playing on that. There's a close-up of Peri's work. And there you can see Patrick Killeran. He's famous, well, he's probably more renowned for the work that we showed, whereby you lay on a table that was attached to a window at the MCA and it slid out, and half of you was inside the building and half of you was outside the building. It was perfectly safe, but it was unnerving, and it's sort of another way of looking at the world. Here, his hammocks are attached by a sort of pulley system to buoys in the, well, they're like railway sleepers, I think, in the water that were moving up and down in the waves, and so you lay on the hammocks and you were kind of rocked in this kind of nice, easygoing way. The artist Narvin Rawanchaikul made this work with the help of Melissa Chu, who was at that stage at, I think it's the 4A Gallery in Chinatown, and working with taxis, telling a story about Sydney, the kind of things that people say in taxis, the surprisingly candid things that people say in taxis, and the idea of the taxi as a kind of confessional. And so you sit in the taxi and you listen to these stories that you're being told, and you can sit around on these little taxi seats and enjoy what you hear at the same time. Pier 2-3 was great, especially renovated, and I think it's since been, transformed into flats or mixed use. But anyway, I understand it's not available anymore. But I was lucky because it was just at this time when it was being sort of fixed up, and it provided me with amazing interior spaces. where I could show the work of Caterina Grosser, for example, who I know has recently shown at Carriage Works here. And this was, one of the first international outings for this extraordinary artist. And as far as this idea of place is concerned, there is this, I was here quality of the work. It's a sort of abstraction that indicates her presence and her very human movement across a room or a space, in this case a corner in the middle of Pier 23. And then this is the work of Beat Stroily, whose Bondi Beach and Parramatta Road series were on show in Pier 23. It was work that he made here and showed here. It's so interesting to 20 years later to see people walking down the streets of Parramatta Road but without mobile phones. It's like a really interesting slice in time. And of course, the technology then is different. I mean, these are 35mm slides in carousels. This is the image that we used for the cover of the Biennale catalogue and also the poster that you see outside. It was an interesting cover, and I mean, lots of conversations about whether or not it was appropriate. Is it a boy, is it a girl? There was that kind of question. And I remember there was one very heated discussion in the board meeting of the Biennale of Sydney where one of the board members said to me, "What has this got to do with Australia?" And it sort of felt pretty obvious to me, but I do think it's fantastic that we have now the artistic director is, in fact, an Asian woman, and I like to think that this, to some extent, was anticipating that. And this is a work that Beat showed opposite the town hall, the corner of George Street and Park Street, something like that. Anyway, there was a building thing going on, and you can see the Queen Victoria building behind, so it's on the opposite corner. So there's a lot of work outside, and I think to a large extent it was inspired by the fact that I had been doing that in London, but also too the idea that a Biennale is not just another show. It's you want it to be something that engages the city, and in the idea that people are sort of tripping over contemporary art when they're not expecting it, and it's sort of feeling sort of more generous by being outgoing. There were a number of venues that I used. I think there were 10 altogether. Art Space is one. This was a work of Carl Andre's that he dedicated to Sol LeWitt, and I juxtaposed it with the work of Shumpon Apisuk, a Thai artist, and also Fernando Gomez, very fragile, but similarly formalist work, and very much about material in that sort of concrete and Brazilian way, and Carl Andre with his thingness of things kind of way. A long story behind this work that, if I had longer, I'd amuse you with. But it's a very strong and muscular piece by him, and definitely, me wanting to sort of assert. It was a Biennale very much about simple things and a pleasure that one derives from simple things. And I was very concerned to play down mediation and reference, and certainly appropriation. If it was something that I definitely resisted for this show. Then at the MCA, I showed the work of Anne Veronica Janssens. This was on the first floor, I think. The Biennale is in third and first floor at the MCA this time. I had 2 floors as well. This was on part of one, and we had Julian Opie there. And actually interesting listening to Lynne too. It was an aspect of her biennial that I wasn't so aware of, and the continuity between what she was doing and me too, because I was very much wanting to assert my interest in craft-oriented practice. So artists that were weaving and embroidering, artists who were using fabric, in the case of Ding Yi, for example, a lot of Aboriginal artists as well. There's those beautiful baskets that you see at the MCA now, and through the advice of John Mundine, I was showing the work of artists like Robin Junjin, beautiful sort of woven sculptural objects. This is Bernard Fries at the Ivan Doherty Gallery, and I would put as a kind of spotlight on some artists, to kind of almost kind of make a reference point. And there were a number of artists in the show, and I think probably all of the curators of the Biennale of Sydney are a bit like this. When asked to make a proposal, you think, what is on your mind right now? Who's interesting you? And Bernard Fries was certainly one of those artists. His kind of dumb painting appealed to me very much. Carl Andre is another, Beat Stroili was another. And Onkawara, as you see, was fundamental. In fact, this is at the Art Gallery of New South Wales. It's more of a mixed bag in terms of the selection. You see the work of Lisa Milroy in the back, Joyce Campbell, a New Zealand artist here. There's Jimmy Woolaloo in the center, sand sculpture. And on the left-hand side, out of the picture, there were a number of works by Onkawara. And he is the artist who makes the date paintings. And he makes date paintings sometimes every day. I hadn't met him, I hadn't worked with him, and it was actually through an introduction made by Lynne Cooke that I first saw him in New York. I said, I'm making this Biennale in Sydney, and it's called Every Day, and I'd like you to be in it. And he laughed and said, well, how could I not be in it? The work that we had in the Art Gallery of New South Wales was great. It was, these lists of people that he met, and then drawings on maps of where he had been in various cities and places around the world. But through our conversations, the idea of showing work in a kindergarten in Sydney became crucial. And it's a project that has gone on now since 1998. It's been shown in more than 20 kindergartens all over the world, in Africa, Latin America, in Canada, north of Scandinavia and whatnot. But the first one was in Darlinghurst Public School, where, coincidentally, my daughter was. It's that negotiation then with the head teacher becomes a lot easier. And, there were questions of security, obviously, and who is this for? It wasn't for a gallery-going crowd. It was actually for the children. That was a point that Onkawara made very strongly. So it was actually a kind of secret at the heart of the Biennale, and the idea that these children who are learning to read, learning to count, who are seeing things for the first time, have this pure consciousness of the world, as he puts it, actually, as he's quoting Leo Tolstoy, in fact. That this sort of sits in the middle of my show. So, it was a kind of ironic factor in the equation, given that the rest of the Biennale was so outgoing. But it wasn't as if we weren't, everybody knew it was there, and it was a tantalizing invisibility. And then it was documented subsequently. We made a small booklet, and, and it's one of those things that, as I say, has gone on to become and seen to be a very important part of his practice. So that was, that's roughly a sort of survey of my biennial, and some sort of important things that kind of occurred to me while I was remembering something that happened 20 years ago. But it did have a profound effect on what I did subsequently, and and you can see it immediately. Look, I went to Birmingham. Lizanne McGregor went from Birmingham to the MCA, and I went from I didn't go from the MCA, but I went from Sydney to Birmingham. And one of the first things I did was a Julian Opie exhibition, and we showed the sheep outside. And we showed the work of Kalamata, here his canal boat. Another work that involves the recycling of materials, the involvement of volunteers, something that's outdoors. So this idea of work outside of the dedicated art space that may or may not be identified as art was quite important to me. Birmingham doesn't have a harbour, but it does have lots of canals. And some people say it has more canals than Venice. But then maybe not quite as beautiful. It doesn't have an opera house, but it does have a symphony hall. And it's a symphony hall where I did this work with Seal Floyer. It's called the Nailbiting Performance. Seal, a British artist now living in Berlin, it makes work that's very minimal and very discreet. And we'd been talking for some time about the idea of her making a performance, and she said, well, if I was to do such a thing, I'd have to perform my nervousness. So it would have to be a nail-biting performance. The idea is that she then goes up onto the stage before an orchestral concert. The dais where the conductor stands is where she then turns to a microphone, and I went, do it for you. But she did for a very long time. Bit every fingernail. And it's kind of a disgusting noise, but it's funny as well, and it was actually very interesting to see the audience come around. This is, subsequently, acknowledged as really a seminal piece and a really smart sort of tautological gesture. But it was a work I wanted to do in the Sydney Opera House. Then they wouldn't let us. They didn't feel it was sufficiently respectful for this sacred site. The Birmingham Symphony Hall doesn't have that aura. It has very good acoustics, though. Working with artists that I had met through the Biennale of Sydney, then sort of went on. So Shimabuku here in Birmingham, when the sky was sea, and the idea that the world is inverted, you look up and you see fish in the sky when, there's a kind of a nice incongruity there. And this sort of very basic idea, meanwhile, life rushes past, a train on its way to London, probably. The work of Anne Veronica Janssens we had outside our building, and you see it here. A greenhouse, really nice, really smart lamination of the panes of glass in order to transform it. So you sort of walk into this fog. It's like walking into it's like walking into a three-dimensional Rothko or something like that. Caterina Grosser, I didn't know her before. Here she is on the outside of Birmingham Central Library with these extraordinary fluorescent colours. This is her work getting more and more colourful. The idea of this building, subsequently demolished, but this brutalist grey building that's dedicated to literature, should be covered with this very gratuitously abstract mark-making, this I was here of Caterina Grosser. Inside icon, you see her making work like this. This is actually a big room. This is about 8 meters high. And it's a really sort of vigorous work, completely in contrast to that of Onkawara's exhibition that happened twice at Icon. I enjoyed my relationship with him enormously, and sadly he passed away 3 years ago. This exhibition was an exhibition of date paintings from every year that he had been making them, and they had to be date paintings made on a Sunday, so they were his Sunday paintings. And they went clockwise around the space of our first floor. And while we were making it, or when it became obvious that Icon was going to do an Onkawara show, a number of other venues around the world said, maybe we could join in and we could collaborate with you. And I say to On, well, look, maybe this exhibition could tour. And he said, on one condition, that it goes clockwise around the world. And it did go clockwise around the world. Unfortunately, it missed Australia. There was a chance of it being in Brisbane. It went to 12 venues. It went so many different places. And it went from Bangkok to Singapore. Singapore is east of Bangkok, isn't it? And I think it is. Or is it? Yeah, no, I think it is, actually. And then, I don't know. Anyway, whatever. And then it jumped to New Zealand, and then it went to Mexico City, and then it went to Lima and Canada. It was a great thing. And then it came back to Icon to be in exactly the same place. So it circumnavigated the world, and exactly to the extent that my technicians could find the original screw holes in the wall and put the work back exactly where it had been in 2002, an exhibition that was entitled The Eternal Return. Then the idea of pure consciousness sort of kept on going. In fact, I'm thinking of doing another one, but this is one that I made in Bethlehem as part of the RIWAC Biennial in 2007, I think, 2007. And to do this in Bethlehem meant a lot to me because of where one is politically, but also what these people are suffering in their everyday lives, and the fact that Onkawara's work largely stems from his experience of the Holocaust and his reaction to Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Also, the idea that I take this exhibition of dates to the birth of the Christian calendar was very neat. And if one's talking about circles, I was in the case of Seal Floyer, and then Onkawara's circumnavigation of the world. There was something very satisfying about taking this exhibition to a kindergarten in Bethlehem. There you get a closer view. It's probably the cutest image that you will see this weekend. Now, Onkawara's a Japanese artist. I'd never been to Japan before. I'd never been to China, and I hadn't been to Thailand, I hadn't been to the Philippines, I hadn't been to Korea. And I would not have done this were it not for the Biennale of Sydney. And this has had a profound effect on my programming. In fact, I would say that Icon probably is in the UK, if not in Europe, one of the preeminently most international venues, and with a very strong emphasis on that part of the world. And Mami mentioned that I had made an exhibition at the Hayward Gallery. It was called Facts of Life, and it was an exhibition of contemporary Japanese art, and I benefited enormously from her advice. Certainly when I was doing the Biennale of Sydney, and actually I benefited enormously from Mami's writing because she contributed an essay to the catalogue of Facts of Life. This is gives you an idea of the show. As you walk into the first room, you've got Nakagawa's extraordinary photograph of flower petals there. You've got Takashi Homa, photographer, on the wall. There is Takafumi Ichikawa, who has created these floating transparent sculptures. He calls them the ghosts of sculpture, which kind of sort of suited me and my sort of insistence that works of art are not discrete and self-contained. And also, incidentally, just for by the way, those seats in the middle of the gallery, those concrete seats, were designed by Julian Opie. Neat. Here is Tatsuo Miyajima. Well, that's his work. Somebody else is standing on it. And Suda, somebody that I showed in Facts of Life, who I had actually shown in Sydney. That's at the MCA. These beautifully crafted flowers made of wood. It was actually through this exhibition that I first came across the work of Atsuko Tanaka, and then I subsequently went on and made a big retrospective at Icon that then toured to Castellón in Spain, but also was the first time her work had been seen as a retrospective in Tokyo at MOT, and that was about 5 years ago, something like that. It's an exhibition of which I'm extremely proud, and I love this, the way she worked on the floor with these circles of color and then dripping these lines between them. They're derived from the work that she did in the 50s, her performances, particularly the electric dress, and they are a sort of stylized abstraction out of circuit diagrams, but they also bear resemblance to our nervous systems, circulatory systems, and so on. This, you'll notice in the front here, there is a mat on the floor with various cushions, and it's here that an actual performance took place. I mean, the performative painting of Tanaka is kind of a beautiful setting then for the actual musical performance of Makoto Nomura, who is an extraordinary musician and interesting to have within the context of an art gallery or a museum. We made, in Birmingham, we worked together with him. He's often worked with Shimabuku. We had a weekend where we made music for people with dogs in an empty gallery. It was unpredictable. It was a bit like jazz, and I don't have a thing about dogs myself, but I mean there are a lot of people who do. It is England, and it was very popular. There is the idea of inclusivity, and this was something too. Of course, one mustn't forget that these were the heady days of relational aesthetics, and I wanted strongly to make the point that it didn't start in Paris, and I don't think that Nicolas Bourriaud sufficiently acknowledged the influence of art from Asia, the places that I had visited during my research for the Biennale of Sydney, and so subsequently I have gone on often to make work by artists who invite audience participation and thereby raise very basic questions about authorship and a definition of art out of cultural traditions that didn't have definitions of art until the mid-19th century, when sort of we came with our ships and religion and art markets and all that kind of jazz. So artists like Recret, Thierry Vernet, really important for me. And he was in my Biennale of Sydney, outside the MCA, when everybody was queuing to get in. He was screening films in a tent and giving away free cans of beer. It was extremely convivial. And there is no Melissa, I'm sorry, there is no photographic record of it, but you just have to believe me, it was wonderful. And if you had to be there. The work that Recrit made for us, it was called Demo Station Number 4. The heart of it was this recreation of a bar that he loved in Puerto Rico, in San Juan, and it had pool tables in it, it had a jukebox, it had this amazing wallpaper, and these lampshades with people's business cards on them. And it was from here that people could get free cups of tea, jasmine tea, I think that's what we served. And then throughout the rest of the gallery, with this idea of well, it's in Japanese, I think. I mean, Mami, we could talk about it afterwards, but the idea of jutsu, not art, but it's of doing things well, a kind of art of living, and a place in Recruit's exhibition whereby people who had particular skills could do things well, could demonstrate them. So, in this exhibition, you could learn how to do origami, you could learn how to do magic tricks, you could learn how to do sculpture with wood, you could learn how to play indoor golf, or you could learn how to play chess. It was a place where you could go and get this. It became a little kind of college, where there'd be someone there. Not all of these trestle tables were manned, but you could be sure that you could come to Icon and there'd be somebody there to teach you something. You may have wanted to learn origami, but you had to learn lace making. It was Recruit wanting to celebrate the fact that people have particular skills, and again, interesting in relation to what Lynne was saying earlier, and what should and should not be inside an art gallery or a museum, and equally, what is it? How do you read art outside the dedicated art space? Speaking of which, these are Soy Project, the next generation of Thai artists, interestingly represented at APT in Queensland not long after we did this project in 2008. And here you have the opportunity to make a sculpture of fruit and exchange it for an actual piece of fruit. So there was a market stall that had real fruit on at the beginning of the day, and towards the end of the day it filled up with these paper sculptures of fruit. Very wholesome, because you were supposed to eat the fruit after you'd made the sculpture. An artist who features here in the Biennale of Sydney is Anya Galaccio. This is a work that is not quite so wholesome, and we're now back inside Icon, but again, the incongruity, it's not a place where normally you find a tree, and these swags of apples, like the roses that you see sandwiched by these glass panes against the gallery wall through the exhibition, start to rot. And the idea of our mortality very strongly communicated, not only by what you see, but also what you smell. And I have to say, by the stain that has been left on our beautifully shuttered concrete floor. It reminds me of Anya every day. In fact, there's a lot to say about Anya, actually, and I realize how often we've worked together, and it's again something that Mami and I share. This is the chocolate room here, which over the course of the exhibition, the chocolate oxidizes and sort of interesting things occur. It's this process that is embodied in the work because of the kinds of materials that she uses that is so interesting. And going back to the Serpentine, as I was leaving, one of the last things I did was program this work, Keep Off the Grass, where we'd had a Tony Smith exhibition outside, and when the sculpture had been removed, it left these scars, where the grass had been, it had died. And so what Anya did was to plant seeds of wildflowers, and then through the summer, these would sort of crop up in those barren spaces, if you like, those little desert landscapes that Tony Smith's sculpture had left behind. Rather, well, it's a little bit more, certainly more beautiful than the rotting apples, but then a kind of idea of, well, that circle of life that is absolutely sort of key to understanding and his work overall. So this is, Annie wasn't in my Biennale, but maybe she would be now. And Ryan Gander wasn't in my Biennale, but maybe, if I'd stepped into that river twice, he might be. This is a show that he did at Icon in 2008. Another young artist that I first met in Maastricht, whose work so interesting at the MCA now, is Marjolein Dijkman. This is work by her, which involves a reconstruction of the table around which the Lunar Society in Birmingham used to meet and talk about ideas that then quickened the Industrial Revolution. And then finally, a work that if I was the artistic director of the Biennale of Sydney in 2018, maybe also I'd include the work of Oliver Beer. Certainly he's going to be in my Quebec biennial next year. I think he's an amazing talent. And a great artist, now in a great Biennale of Sydney. Thank you very much.
Now I would like to welcome the Lynne Cooke again on the stage, and then also Jonathan. So we have half an hour. You're welcome to prepare for your own questions. But I was very pleased to hear a lot of resonance with what I have selected, particularly with Jonathan, with so many artists in common, but with Lynne's work with idea of different medium and textile, and craft-oriented artists and different appreciation for the materiality. And I could associate so much with what you have done. I wish I could have seen it.
Yeah, me too.
I think you can do so many different ways of biennales, but just wanted to ask, would you do something different 20 years later? What has changed? And
yes, is this on?
yes,
Absolutely. It's a different moment. One can't step into the same river twice. But amongst the many things that have changed, we live in what's called the global turn. So when I was working, partly I had no knowledge of art of East Asia at all, also, or India for that matter. And as with any biennale, there were financial constraints. So choosing where to travel and what to incorporate or where to look became a key issue. And given the geographical location of Australia and its cultural position as well as its geographical one, working and exploring a Southeast Asian context was one of the things I did that I wouldn't have been able to do otherwise. That map is very much more familiar today. So I think the role of geography has changed dramatically and may not play such an important determining factor if I were to think about how to make a biennale in this country again. That said, what hasn't changed, I think, is the difficulty of bringing large-scale work into this country where there is no market and there is very little other opportunity of showing it once it's got here. And unlike, say, the world of literature or film, where those artworks travel easily, and people here can be as immediately informed by films made anywhere in the world or books written in English or other languages. That's not true with many art objects, and they won't come here other than under the auspices of the Biennale, which is one of them. It is the most well-endowed show, I think, in the country.
Jonathan, you already mentioned a few artists that you might have included if you do 2018 or 2020.
Yeah. I mean, definitely I'd do it differently, and I mean, also because one's experience since then has changed such a lot. I mean, and I mean, a lot has happened. I mean, current affairs are extraordinary right now, and it would be hard not to refer to them. I mean, I am interested. I mean, my Biennale was not overtly political, but the politics come through sort of in between the lines. And, you know, I'd probably work in the same way now. 9/11 happened, and it's kind of hard not to, the world changed dramatically, and there are a lot of artists who are working in places that we just weren't sort of aware of before. You referred to my work in Iraq, and I'd be probably looking a little bit more closely in that part of the world. I mean, I could name names, but I think and that would be invidious. But I think, I mean, and also you just get, you get older, and you just, you see life slightly differently. And you also, I mean, you also become not a devil's advocate exactly, but I mean, it's rhetorical, an exhibition, and there's an awful lot that you like that you don't put in because you've decided to go down this line. And I could have taken a different one. It was just sort of where the global conversation was at the time. If I wouldn't make an everyday biennial now because people have banged on about the everyday such a lot, but it may be hard to believe, but at the time people weren't. In the same way that back in the 1980s, amazing to say, but people didn't talk about Duchamp so much, and maybe I would have come up with a ready-made boomerang back in 10 years earlier. And I think the biennial that I'm making in Quebec is about much more about where we are in relation to the environment right now, and it would be equally valid to do that in Australia.
I also wanted to ask you about the selection of the sites, and because so much work has strong relationship with the venues and places, but did you have like freedom of any place you wanted to work, or?
No, I don't remember discussions about choosing between sites. I think that was fairly well sorted out before I came on board, and I wasn't looking for an island. It didn't occur to me that I might find an island. I think the discussion was framed totally differently. There was a lot of work here at the Art Gallery of New South Wales, at Artist Space, at the Ivan Doherty. I made an exhibition that was certainly smaller in terms of numbers by design. There were about 40 artists plus a film program, so about 45 probably in total. I'd done the Carnegie International in '91, and there were about the same number of artists. It seemed to me if one wants to make a show with a fairly strong, cohesive thematic to it, or argument, that you get to a certain point beyond which the argument simply splinters and falls apart. And so that's one reason for cutting the numbers back. And the second is that although people in Sydney can come frequently, anybody from anywhere else will probably come for a day or a day and a half. And trying to come to terms with the work of more than 40 artists in a day and a half just seems to me indigestible. And therefore limiting the number of artists and having more work by each individually, or a more substantive work, seemed a better course to take.
How did you end up looking for island?
Yeah, no, I like the idea that, with the exception of the island, that everything was within walking distance, and that you could traipse through the city. It strikes me that the MCA and the Art Gallery of New South Wales and Art Space on this side of town are kind of neat sort of bookends, if you like, for quite an interesting itinerary. And it's like an amphitheatre, Sydney Harbour, and I wanted to sort of capitalise on that. And having the island in the middle, I don't know why I wanted it so much, but the harbour was so present, and I wanted to, as you know, I wanted this exhibition that was more outdoors, and I remember somebody saying to me, with the idea of access, who do you think will want to get on a boat and go to an island in the middle of the harbour for nothing? Well, I can't imagine. So, but I mean, I think I did have more. I probably had more choice. I mean, the Biennale had sort of gone down and gone up again since Lynne's time, and I was here, sort of and involved in the process of re-establishing it with Paula, and probably there was kind of more that we could sort of make up from scratch as a result. And so, I mean, there were definitely we're going to work in arts at Art Space, for example. But Pier 23 wasn't certain when I first arrived, and we were looking, how much of the MCA would be available. We don't know all of that kind of stuff. I mean, it all evolved while I was working on it.
Was it the first time that Biennale used MCA? Because I don't think Lynne used. Yeah, so it's the first time that.
Paula's nodding her head, and I think probably was.
First time, yes. Yeah. Maybe I'd really like to open the question to our selected audience. Yes, Mel will bring you a microphone.
We had, yes, we had a number of little talks and discussions, Mami's archives, and there was lots of soul searching and a high level of anxiety, I felt, maybe not from Mami, but from other speakers and the audience, about the meaning and future of biennales and what is the point of biennales when there are 200 of them. I was wondering whether you have any comments, Lynne and Jonathan.
I think one can't generalize. In some situations, I think they make an enormous contribution because they are the central vehicle by which a large amount of contemporary art from across the globe comes together in one place. And that's certainly true, as I understand it, in Australia, and that's been the function of the Sydney Biennial and one of its important functions. Maybe it's less important to have a Biennale in London or in New York, where you have vast amounts of contemporary art there all the time. I mean, one could debate how important the Whitney Biennial is, given how much American art is there all the time. But arguably, it reaches a different audience in part, or it has an interpretive function. I'm not going to make an argument for or against it, but I do think that Sao Paulo, Gwangju, Sydney stand out for what they contribute to the environments, cultural environments, and including a continuing history and debate from people in those regions who see one after another. And that's how much of the art discourse is played out. That's the public arena for a great deal of it. So yes, they can be very important.
And I mean, I agree completely with Lynne. And it's a bit like painting. I mean, there's the death of painting has been predicted so many times, and it never happens, and it never happens. And Biennale is the same. Ever since I've been aware of biennales, I've been hearing that they're on the way out and nobody really wants them and likes them, but there seem to be more and more of them, and it suggests that they are wanted. For one reason or another.
Any other questions? Paula.
It's good that the questions kind of are from Melissa's point of view, they're all kind of roughly in the same area. I mean, people at the back row, if you want to ask a question, you must think of her.
Since you've done so much work in so many parts of the world, I was just wondering if you'd like to talk about your observations of the different audiences in different places.
To both of us, or?
Yes.
Well, I can. I mean, it is interesting. You know, a Biennale in Sydney has developed an audience for a Biennale in Sydney, I think, and the archival work that you're doing sort of demonstrates that. In the same way that you know, people get used to a kind of program in a museum or a gallery, they sort of come to accept a certain kind of style or set of attitudes. I've worked in China and a lot, and audiences there, I would say I've only ever made a blockbuster once, and that was in Shanghai, where people went around the block, but I don't think they really understood what it was about. But it was a sort of cool place to be, and a lot of young people went. And whatever the proposition of the exhibition was, I think it probably eluded most people, whereas I think probably here and in Sao Paulo, where biennales have been more established, people are, through public programs and events like this, are sort of coming to terms more fundamentally with the propositions. But it's hard to generalize. I mean, Quebec, you can't have a more sort of self-consciously, sort of artistically thinking crowd as well there. So, but biennales very often are inserted into the cultural life of a city to start something. And the Shanghai, I did the Shanghai Biennale in 2006, and that's the way it felt to me. But I bet now, 12 years later, it's different.
I think venues come with audiences in part, and one can construct audiences if one works in a place over time, whether it's you in Birmingham or when I worked at DIA for nearly 20 years. An audience was built, and one knew the shape of the audience in part and had an ongoing debate with an audience through programming and of exhibitions and ancillary programs. I find doing one-off shows in other places quite unpredictable, and made one exhibition in Doha. It was a solo show with Luke Toymans, and I had no idea of who was going to see it, and I still have very little idea of who saw it. And I think for me, one of the complexities of the show looking back was feeling I was working in a vacuum. That was my lack of experience with that part of the world, but it was also something about the constitution of audiences in that city. And that, in retrospect, I think I felt the absence of an audience in a way that I hadn't anticipated. I think how audiences respond is unpredictable, but there can be very rewarding responses. And I would, I suppose, speak to the show I opened in Washington 6 weeks ago, which has had an audience, or has had audience responses that were completely unanticipated. And in large part, I think one could say it's a show called Outliers in American Vanguard Art, and it brings a great deal of work that could loosely be put under an umbrella of self-taught into the gallery. And from the day it was proposed, there has been comments that the National Gallery doesn't show work of this kind. That's been said with great enthusiasm, and it's been said as a reason for not doing the show. And the response to the show has been that the National Gallery doesn't do things like this, and some of it has been a great deal of it, at least as I hear it. I'm sure that's not all the answer, but it has wildly exceeded my expectations for who might be seeing it and what people are thinking about having seen it. Totally unpredictable.
My experience in Sharjah was what Lynne was describing in Doha, and I remember giving a talk in, we used to talk about biennales we were going to do, and it was at the Miami art fair, and I'll never forget Norman Rosenthal, who then was the exhibition secretary of the Royal Academy, said something, "But who will go and see it, Jonathan?" And he was kind of right, because people came to the opening, and then I don't think very many people did afterwards. I mean, we all go out as like an art crowd, and we see it, and we have a great time. Amazing, isn't it? What Sharjah's like, but it wasn't a very well-developed learning program, and there could have been. I loved the show. I think it was great, but I think it wasn't then sustained. But now I think it's a very different story, and it would be very interesting to know through your archival research how things were in Sydney. I mean, when the Biennale of Sydney started, it probably didn't reverberate with the general public, but the fact that Franco and Transfield stuck with it and kept on going, to the point where.
It's really one of my reasons that I thought I need to look at the archive and what has been already shown in the city is suddenly I realized that looking at all the catalogs and then also all the list of the artists, there's so many great artists have been already shown to this selected audiences, and the professional sort of experienced audiences. So I thought I must know what has done already before I start doing something. So obviously it's very different experienced audience, I think.
Just following on from the idea of how audiences respond to biennales, would either Jonathan or Lynne like to talk about what sort of response you were anticipating when you did your biennale, given that both of you had prior knowledge of Australia?
I mean, my biennale wasn't well received.
And then perhaps how that might have evolved in time, whether you got subsequent feedback over time. Did it somehow mature in our memories, and was the response more positive?
Yeah, I don't know. Liam. In fact, it was. Very often said that people have already made up their mind that the Biennale isn't a good one before it opens, and to some extent, I felt that. It was. I think almost all the local press was negative.
Really?
I think so. I mean, the international press was positive, but it was not. It wasn't a particularly pleasant experience hearing it. But on the other hand, I liked it myself, and the artists seemed to like it too. So that was kind of enough for me.
Mine too had very divided press, extremely divided press, one might say, of a kind I don't think I've ever had.
No, me neither. No.
I guess people care a lot.
It was it's interesting actually how personal it was. It was so sort of unnecessarily personal.
Yeah, even before I start, a few people already told me that nobody's going to say good about your Biennale. So before it opened, so I was prepared.
Sorry, where were the other two?
The one in... I think, Facts of Life, Tate Triennial, Shanghai, they all went down quite well, actually. And Sydney didn't put me off putting on biennales.
Working at the Carnegie International was nothing like... the press responses were nothing like this. It's the ad hominem the personalized responses here that stick out, I think. And why, I have no idea.
It was really interesting, actually. I mean, we could go for a drink later and talk about it between ourselves. But I'll never forget Bernard Fries saying to me, "Jesus," oh, not Jesus. He said, "Jonathan, amazing how personal this, this criticism is." And then the next week in the Australian or Sydney Morning Herald, he got a similarly vicious review of his show at Ivan Doherty Gallery. I don't know, I mean, maybe those were the days. And it's not like that anymore. I mean, people like John MacDonald hated what I was doing. The other thing, actually, too, I think that probably Lynne, it's the same for Lynne as it was for me. People had paid to see the Biennale then. But the year after, the next Biennale was free.
Yes.
So it was a kind of a friendlier thing, and you could sort of come and go, and you weren't having to pay $20 or whatever it was that you needed to spend. And I think that probably that could have transformed people's perception of the Biennale.
I think we should make a distinction between press responses and on-the-ground responses. And responses one hears about later. I would say that the press response was different from on-the-ground response, as I experienced it. Maybe not for you.
Well, you never know, do you? When people tell you, they say, "Oh, it was lovely, loved it," and then they go, and then they turn around and say something completely different. No, I don't know. I don't know.
Any other questions? Everyone has to think one question. Because you're so selected.
Well, can I ask you why you think the press was like that?
Luca has a question.
Does anyone in the audience have some theories about the role of the press and who and why?
Well,
yes, Suzanne, you do.
Lynne, I think your point is well made. It was the print media mainly that was exceedingly personal and negative, driven in part for reasons of almost competition between two, at that time, very conservatively inclined critics, and who had been overheard to say that they would never allow such a show to be delivered again, that they would work together to ensure that no such exhibition was ever delivered again. So, I mean, and one would have to ask those people exactly what was motivating them. But the more professional and considered responses in the print media and amongst professionals was extremely engaged and positive. So the why of it, I think one would have to go back and look carefully at the writing of particular individuals. And it then becomes a sort of, it is as if that is the currency. And it distorts absolutely anybody's reading or understanding of the exhibition.
Maybe to...
I think I agree with that. I'm just trying to formulate, I was trying to help the audience here with another question, and now it's somewhat sort of disappeared. It's difficult to know that point of yours, Jonathan, about, does the audience really like the show if they tell you in your face? What is the metric? We used to sort of think that the metric was the numbers, how many people went through the show. Is that a good indication of the success? And even then you could argue, well, not necessarily if people have sort of amongst themselves said this is a bad show and they turn away, so it's not a popular show, but still amongst the critics, amongst the conoscenti who are not the those two critics, but it's regarded as good. So, yeah, but this is almost in the nature of the Biennale. It's controversial. You know, you've both been indicating that the contemporary art practice is pushing edges. Is it always going to be acknowledged for what it is? It's kind of the nature of the beast.
Oh yeah, I mean, I think if you're thin-skinned, being a contemporary art curator is not the job for you.
No, that's true, and I agree with you, Luca. I think shows get understood in retrospect, and they can be a slow burn. It can take 4 or 5 years, a decade, and then retrospectively, a show can be seen to have been more fertile or productive than was recognized at the time. So yes, it's not only the immediate response, and Suzanne, I agree with you too. The daily press is journalism. That's not necessarily, that doesn't have the depth of critical insight that we expect from other forms of press, whether it's journals or art magazines or the like.
I think now we are in a social media time, so different people have different voices. So there's completely different measurement how you see from ordinary people's voices. But also it's difficult, again, in a different perspective, that people want spectacular work and how much they get excited by, and also people ask for this participatory work. How many participatory work are you having in a show? So as more the audience for the contemporary art has grown, then different demands, different requests are coming in the multiple layers. So I see that it's quite interesting how one exhibition could respond to those expectations.
And we see it in things like expanded wall labels and object labels and the kinds of information that are felt to be relevant, the backstory to the making of works, which was not necessarily the case in the past.
Mm-hmm. If it's any comfort to you, I don't remember many positive reviews about any exhibitions in Australia in the main newspapers, and I think there is a slight embarrassment. Maybe it's a very Australian thing that you might enjoy and admire an exhibition of any sort, any kind of art event.
There's the one question.
Yeah. I think we acquitted ourselves well and felt we'd done a good job. You know.
I just wanted to make a comment. I think it's a bit too much that we are saying that the daily press is bad and wrong. I mean, we live in a moment where the press is tremendously important for democracy and is being attacked devilishly and fiendishly, for example, by President Trump. And so I think it's a bit cliche to say, we are so great because we are avant-garde and we are radical and we are criticized, and the depth of analysis only comes from highbrow critical reviews. I mean, I do agree that some things get reassessed over time, and that's normal, and we like Shakespeare, although many people hated Shakespeare for centuries and so forth. But we shouldn't exaggerate, that's all, because then it could become a little bit of navel-gazing. I am very interested in what the general so-called superficial press sometimes says. This is not to say that I disagree fully, but we are in a different historical period, and it's important to think about those people and not consider them just slaves to some popular thinking that's necessarily wrong. I mean, they are keeping us also from fascism right now.
I think you're putting words into our mouth, Carolyn.
Excuse me? No, I didn't mean you individually, but there's a general feeling in the room that everybody's so happy because every exhibition is so criticized and the stupid press makes mistakes. I just don't mean any individual, but it's the collective feeling that I'm hearing once you put together all the different comments that everybody's making after the lectures about this press question, that I think becomes, can be seen, at least by me, as edging onto something problematic. It's not the individual comments by anyone, but the totality of the comments that were crowned by the last comment about I've never seen an exhibition in Australia being celebrated. I think that's a bit much. I don't know if it's an Australian question of self-flagellation, but I feel it's too much. That's just a feeling. I wanted to throw this feeling into this debate about the press.
Maybe it's changed. Is it? I mean, how has it been for you?
I would say it's been great. But I would like to bring this discussion to tomorrow. We have 2 more distinguished speakers, and probably we can continue this discussion tomorrow morning, if that's okay. Thank you very much for Lynne and Jonathan for great lectures and comments on present state. And thank you very much for your audience for participating actively. Thank you very much.